Pretty much most of my videos demonstrating watch servicing techniques involve shock-protected watches. And well, this is because the escapements of most, if not all, modern watch movement calibers are indeed shock-protected. And even the movement that we use for demonstration purposes with my watch repair course has a shock protection system. Aside from the major benefit of reducing the risk of damage should a watch suffer a trauma, most shock protection systems within modern watches are easier to deal with when it comes to lubrication as opposed to non-shock protected movements. There are several kinds of shock protection systems which have been designed by various movement builders, ranging from the ever so popular Inca block assembly, which can be found on many Swiss ETA calibers, to other systems such as Novodiac, Diashock and KIF. But all of these designs essentially accomplish the same goal, that is to provide a spring buffer to absorb energy from shock impulses should a watch be dropped or receive a hard knock. With non-shock protected movements, the risk of damage to the balance staff and its cap jewels is much greater. If a watch suffers a trauma, quite often the balance staff pivots will bend or snap, or the balance jewels will crack or even crumble to pieces. Watch jewels are very hard, but they are also very brittle. Either way, it can lead to quite a pricey repair job. Another downside to non-shock balance jewels becomes apparent while servicing older movement, this being the method of lubrication. You see, in order for the balance within a watch movement to maintain its performance, the bearings need to be adequately lubricated. Typically, this involves applying a certain amount of oil, such as Mobius 9010, to the balance end stone. With shock-protected assemblies, oiling the end stone simply involves releasing a spring, called a shock spring, and removing the jewel. Now, one of my students sent me an email recently and mentioned that he's working on a watch with non-shock setting. Norman said it seemed fiddly placing a small drop of oil on a capstone and then trying to get the setting screwed down properly without making a mess of the drop of oil. Now, I can understand his frustration. You see, with non-shock settings, things get a little bit more complicated if you wish to lubricate the balance end stones properly, especially with regards to the balance cock end stone. The main plate end stone is usually easier to deal with, but we'll get to that shortly. Although there are exceptions, most non-shock end stones require the complete disassembly of the balance from the balance cock so that the end stone can be removed, cleaned, lubrication applied, and then reassembled. And of course, this can be risky. The potential for damaging the very sensitive hairspring is that much greater, and then, as Norman already mentioned, it's much more fiddly. Now, when you apply lubrication to any end stone, whether shock protected or non-shock protected, the principles are the same. The amount of oil needs to be appropriate for the size of the end stone, and too much oil or oil that ends up displaced from the center of the jewel may well displace further, leaving a dry bearing. But the issue Norman is having is something that many learner watch repairers will come across. Now, as mentioned, removing a shock-protected balance end stone will usually involve releasing a spring, which then allows you to remove the setting, and all of this can be done whilst the balance is mounted on the movement main plate. But most non-shock balancers require the removal of the balance and then complete disassembly of the balance cock because the screws holding the end stone mounting are quite often on the underside of the balance cock, and attempting to remove these screws whilst the balance is still mounted to the cock, well, that's very dangerous. And in fact, you can see here some older pocket watch movements where the end stone mounting screws are not on the underside. However, I would still recommend removing the balance wheel from the cock before attempting to undo these screws in order to reduce the risk of damage to the balance wheel, staff, jewels, or the hairspring, and remembering in particular that the end stone jewels are very brittle, and the downwards pressure that you exert to loosen these screws could well cause them to shatter or crack. Now let's demonstrate by taking apart this non-shock protected balance. You may notice here that there are no screw heads exposed, and this suggests that the end stone mount is secured from the underside of the balance cock. First, I'll remove the balance from the movement. And now we can observe the end stone mount screws are here under the hairspring. So in order to safely loosen these screws, we need to remove the balance wheel and the hairspring as a whole from the balance cock. The index will often have an eccentric which can be turned, so I'll turn that some 90 degrees. And now, if I loosen the stud screws slightly, the balance can be removed and set aside in a dust tray. Now it's possible for me to remove the end stone mount by first loosening the two mounting screws. And we're left with three parts: the balance cock, the index, and the end stone mount. The jewel bearing within the balance cock doesn't need to be removed unless it's damaged and needs replacing, and the end cap jewel also does not need to be removed from the mount. So now, after cleaning all the parts, it's time to lubricate and reassemble the balance. Oil is applied to the end stone and the index is placed in position. And this is where it can be tricky, setting the balance cock in place without displacing the oil from its center position. Now here's a tip to greatly decrease the risk of oil displacement. Notice that the index sits proud of the end stone mount here. You can use that to your advantage. Place the cock loosely on top of the index, but don't press down until you're 100% sure that you have the screw holes aligned, and then using a pair of brass tweezers or pegwood, hold the cock in position firmly whilst you secure the end stone mount with its screws, tightening them carefully and one at a time. If either of the screw holes become misaligned whilst you do this, well, then you'll need to start again. You'll need to clean, lubricate, and then reassemble. Now when you've done this correctly, you should observe that the oil on the end stone will be a circle, and you should then be able to reassemble the balance and continue with the movement service. Now with non-shock systems, you should also consider the end stone mounted to the main plate. This is far easier to deal with, but well, there's also a risk of displacing the oil whilst securing the mount back to the plate. I'll first place badly so that I can demonstrate how the oil will look if it's displaced. Now looking closely at the mounted end stone, you may be able to observe the oil is not in a circle, it's displaced. This is a fail and will ultimately degrade the performance of the watch. I'll take it apart and we shall try again. When oiling the end stone, you'll need to turn it over and place it in its seating carefully so that the screw holes are aligned. Now if you do not get the holes aligned and you subsequently turn the end stone mount in order to align the screw holes, well, you've most likely already displaced the oil. All will need to be cleaned again and you will need to attempt to refit the end stone. Now it's tedious and it requires a lot of practice, but oiling non-shock end stones manually is how we all learn. But as you progress as a watch repairer, you might well consider investing in an automatic oiler. These also require some practice in order to use correctly, but they do make lubricating end stones a lot easier, whether shock protected or non-shock protected. You still need to disassemble the end stone, and you have to make sure that they are clinically clean before lubrication, but the difference is you reassemble the end stones dry of lubrication, and then you can use the automatic oiler afterwards so as to reduce the risk of oil displacement. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.